Stand up, turn around, you're being detained. Do it now.
Stop. Don't put your hands on me like I'm a suspect when you can't name a crime.
I don't need to argue with you. Hands behind your back.
You're trying to cuff the owner of this shop in front
That's
of my
what you're
staff
doing.
and customers.
This booth is covered by security cameras with audio, and she's recording too.
The wild thing about the story was how ordinary it looked at first, and this is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we get into it, I want one thing from you. Say where you're watching from in the comments. City, state, country, whatever you're comfortable with. And if you care about stories where people quietly stand their ground against profiling and abuse of power, hit like and subscribe so more people actually see this. By the time the officer had his hand on the cuffs, Derek Cole was already standing. He had been in the corner booth of his own coffee shop, laptop open, bank tab on the screen, when the patrol officer walked straight over and turned a normal Tuesday into a detention. Now the officer was inches away, one hand hovering near Derek's wrist, the other resting on his belt, blocking the path out of the booth. The shop was mostly empty. One guy near the window, headphones on, a woman at the bar with a book, Maya, the barista, frozen behind the counter. Music played at low volume, just enough to underline how quiet everything else had become. The officer kept repeating that he needed to see Derek's ID. Not because of a call, not because of a report. He had already admitted there was no complaint, no suspect, no described crime. He just said the man in the corner looked suspicious and might be casing the place, or might have done something to the owner. He said it while standing 3 steps away from the actual owner. Derek had asked for a legal reason. The officer never gave one. Instead, he shifted into questions about Derek's legal status, asked if he was in the country lawfully, and hinted that people who had nothing to hide never refused to show ID. Each time Derek repeated that he was not required to hand over ID under those conditions, the officer's tone got sharper. He announced that he was detaining Derek, told him to stand up, and leaned in like he expected a fight. Derek stood, kept his hands visible, and still did not raise his voice. That was the moment when the power game changed from just words to physical control. The officer started to take Derek's arm to turn him for cuffs. What the officer did not notice, at least not right away, was the black dome in the ceiling corner above the pastry case. Security cameras had a clear angle on the corner booth. Another camera covered the entrance. Both had audio. Both backed up to the cloud without anyone touching a button. He also did not notice the small movement at the counter. Maya had taken her phone out, angling it just enough to keep both men in frame. She did not say anything. She just held it still. From the officer's perspective, this was simple. A lone black man in a hoodie in a mostly empty shop, not sitting at the counter, not behind the bar, refusing to show ID and asking legal questions he did not like. In his mind, that added up to trouble. From Derek's side, it was very different. He had been reviewing vendor invoices. He had opened the shop at 7 a.m., done the morning rush, handed the bar to Maya, and sat down to handle the numbers. His coffee cup, with the shop's logo he had designed himself, was still on the table next to his laptop. To understand how they got to the cuffs, you have to back up about half an hour. 30 minutes earlier, Cornerstone Cafe had looked exactly like any other small urban coffee shop, trying to get through a slow mid-morning. Derek had done what he did most weekdays. He checked the espresso machine, restocked the pastry case, and went over the schedule with Maya. The early crowd had come and gone. A couple of remote workers had settled in with laptops. The place was calm. Derek was not dressed like people imagine a business owner. He was in a black hoodie with the shop logo, dark jeans, and clean sneakers. No apron, no name tag. He liked to blend in with his own customers when he wasn't on bar. People who knew the shop knew him. People who didn't usually assumed he was just another regular. Around 10:15, a marked patrol car rolled slowly past the front windows. The officer inside, Ryan Keller, glanced in and saw a nearly empty room and one black man alone in the corner with a laptop. He did not see any argument. He did not see anyone waving for help. He did not see anything being stolen. He just saw a scene that, in his mind, felt off. Instead of keeping driving, he circled the block, doubled back, and parked. He did not radio in a call. He did not report a disturbance. He told himself he was just doing a welfare check and making sure nothing had happened to the owner he claimed to know. When he walked in, Maya greeted him like any other customer. He did not respond. He did not ask her if everything was okay. He scanned, locked onto Derek, and walked straight toward the corner booth. From the start, his questions were not neutral. He asked Derek what he was doing there, then immediately demanded ID. When Derek asked what this was about, Keller said he wanted to make sure he belonged there, mentioned that he knew the owner, and implied that Derek might be casing the business or had done something to the person who ran it. Derek kept his answers short. He said he was sitting in a coffee shop working on his laptop. He said he was not obligated to provide ID without cause. He asked if there had been a call. Keller admitted there had not. He said he had just seen something that looked suspicious and decided to come in. Instead of backing down, he pushed further. He started asking where Derek was from originally, whether he was a citizen, whether he had any outstanding warrants. None of those questions had anything to do with someone sitting in a chair with a paid-for drink in front of him. Maya watched the shift. The customers watched it too, even if they pretended not to stare. Keller's body language changed as soon as Derek did not immediately comply. His stance widened. His voice got louder. He repeated that he needed ID and that Derek was now being detained for refusing. Derek reminded him that simply sitting in a coffee shop was not a crime and that the officer had not named any law he was suspected of breaking. He pointed out that the officer had entered without any call for service and was now escalating based on nothing more than a feeling. That was when Keller reached down toward his cuffs. He told Derek to turn around and started to take his wrist. Derek did not yank away, but he did straighten and look him dead in the face. He said, as evenly as he could, that the officer was currently trying to cuff the owner of the shop during business hours without a legal reason. He said he had operated Cornerstone Cafe for years. He said he personally knew Captain Angela Reese, the precinct commander, who came in regularly. He told Keller that this entire interaction was on his own security system and now on at least one phone in the room. He added that if Keller kept going, the next place they would see each other would be in court, in a case about unlawful detention and profiling, with video from every angle. That was the exact second Keller's expression changed. And that was where the real story began. For a second, nothing moved. The officer still had one hand on his cuffs and the other on Derek's wrist. Derek had just finished telling him, in a steady voice, that he was putting hands on the owner of the business in the middle of business hours, with no complaint and no identified crime. He also told him that every inch of it was being recorded. He mentioned the ceiling cameras and Maya's phone, and he repeated that he knew the precinct captain personally and would be taking the stop to court as unlawful detention. That combination finally landed. Officer Keller's eyes went up to the camera in the corner, then to Maya's phone, then back to Derek. His grip loosened. The cuffs stayed in his hand, but the intent shifted. He stepped back half a step, still trying to hold onto authority. He said he was only checking on the safety of the business, said he had the right to make sure nothing was wrong, and tried to frame the whole thing as routine. He used the word misunderstanding. He did not mention that there had never been a call. Derek did not sit down. He did not pretend nothing had happened. He reminded the officer of what had just occurred. He told Keller that this was exactly the kind of behavior that departments claim they are trying to fix, and that this specific stop was now documented from 3 angles plus Bodycam. He added that if the officer chose to continue, he would be doing so knowing in advance that civil litigation would follow. Maya stayed behind the counter, still recording. The two customers kept watching. Nobody was confused about who had crossed the line. Keller tried one more time to salvage his version. He said he knew the owner and had been worried something had happened. Derek answered that if the officer truly knew the owner, he would have recognized him, or at minimum, checked with staff before treating him as a suspect. That fact was undeniable. Keller had not asked a single question at the counter. Before zeroing in on Derek, the officer's posture changed again. The edge in his voice faded. He put the cuffs back in their case. He adjusted his belt and announced that he was not arresting Derek and that he was leaving. He repeated that he had only been trying to make sure everything was okay. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the profiling. He just walked out. The door closed behind him. The shop went quiet except for the low music and the espresso machine. For a moment, Derek stayed standing. His heart rate was up, but his voice, when he finally spoke to Maya, stayed normal. He asked her to stop the recording and save it. He asked the customers if they had seen what happened. One nodded. The other said they had it on video as well. Derek sat back down at the corner booth, but he did not go back to his spreadsheet. He opened a blank document instead and started typing out a timeline. Time the officer walked in. What was said? When the first demand for ID was made. When legal status came up. The moment hands went on his wrist. The exact point when he identified himself as the owner and named the captain. He pulled the footage from the cafe system to an external drive. He made sure Maya's clip and the customer's clip were backed up. He stored copies in cloud folders under neutral names. By the time he closed the laptop an hour later, the incident was written out in detail, with timestamps and a list of witnesses. The confrontation inside the shop was over. The next part would not be face-to-face. It would be paperwork, email, and internal review. Right after the officer left, Derek did not argue with anyone, and he did not post anything online. He focused on evidence. He locked the front door for a few minutes and checked the security footage. The cameras clearly showed the officer entering with no visible emergency, walking past the counter, going straight to Derek, demanding ID, grabbing his wrist, and then backing off only after Derek said he was the owner and mentioned the captain in court. Maya's phone video had clear audio of the officer talking about legal status, saying he knew the owner, and admitting there had been no complaint or active case. Derek saved everything. He exported the shop's camera clips, backed them up in the cloud, and saved Maya's video and a short clip from a customer who had recorded when the cuffs came out. Then he documented it in writing. He made a timeline. Time the officer entered each demand for ID, when legal status came up, the physical grab, the moment he identified himself as the owner, and when the officer left. He kept it factual with no exaggeration and attached the badge number he had read off the uniform. He filed 3 things: a formal complaint with internal affairs through the city system, listing the incident as unlawful detention and biased conduct in a public business, with all witnesses and video noted. A direct email to Captain Angela Reese explaining that one of her officers had tried to detain the owner of Cornerstone Cafe with no complaint, no crime, and on-camera references to legal status. A contact to a civil rights attorney stating that he was exploring legal action for unlawful detention and profiling, and that full video evidence existed. Inside the department, the case was opened under a complaint number. Internal Affairs pulled the officer's body cam. The captain viewed it with them. The body cam confirmed Derek's version. No call for service, no visible threat. A man calmly sitting with a laptop. Repeated demands for ID without cause, immigration-related questions, and an attempt to cuff him that stopped only after he revealed he was the owner. They compared that to the short report the officer wrote at the end of his shift, which tried to frame the incident as a safety check with a non-compliant subject in a possibly burglarized business. The video did not match that description. At that point, the investigation was no longer optional. It was on record with video, with the business owner fully cooperating and represented. The incident had moved out of the coffee shop and into official files, where it would follow that officer's name from then on. The investigation did not drag on for years. It moved fast because the evidence was simple and complete. Internal Affairs finished their review and wrote it down in clear terms. The officer had entered a private business without any call, decided on his own that a man sitting quietly was suspicious, demanded ID without reasonable suspicion, used legal status questions with no connection to any crime, and initiated physical detention of someone who was not suspected of anything. They concluded that his written report did not match the video. They marked his statements as inaccurate and his conduct as out of policy. Keller was pulled from patrol. First, it was administrative leave during an investigation, then it became a suspension without pay for a set number of days. He lost eligibility for certain assignments. A formal reprimand went into his file. He was ordered to complete remedial training on constitutional stops, bias, and interactions in businesses open to the public. It was not just a slideshow. It was monitored, documented, and tied to his performance reviews. At the same time, the city attorney's office looked at the footage and Derek's complaint and saw risk. They knew a lawsuit could pull all of this into federal court and public records. The body cam would not look good on the stand. Derek's attorney laid out the claims: unlawful detention, racial profiling, and interference with his business. The videos supported every point. The attorney did not make threats. They submitted a detailed demand letter with timestamps. The city chose settlement before a lawsuit was filed. Derek agreed to a monetary settlement in certain terms. The agreement covered his claims for the detention, the profiling, and the impact on his business. Some details stayed confidential, but the key facts did not change. The city acknowledged policy violations, and the officer did not walk away clean. Inside the department, the case did more than punish one person. It turned into a training example. Captain Reese pushed for changes. A written directive went out to patrol officers that said, for walk-in suspicious person checks in open businesses, officers must first contact staff or visible management if it is safe. ID demands must be tied to specific articulable suspicion, not just a feeling that someone doesn't belong. Questions about immigration or legal status are prohibited unless directly tied to an active investigation where that information is legally relevant. Reports must match Bodycam. Any major mismatch triggers automatic review. Supervisors started using the cafe footage in internal briefings. New recruits watched how the stop began and how quickly it turned bad once the officer relied on assumptions instead of facts. They saw how fast it changed again when the owner asserted his position, named the captain, and referenced court. In the neighborhood, Cornerstone Cafe stayed open like always. Regulars kept coming in. A few new customers showed up after hearing about what happened. Some had seen the incident mentioned in a small local article that covered the investigation and policy changes without naming last names. Derek did not turn the story into his brand. He did not hang the settlement check on the wall. The only visible change in the shop was a small sign near the register with a simple message about cameras, transparency, and respect. Behind the scenes, he kept a printed copy of the official apology letter from the department and the closure notice from Internal Affairs in a folder in his office. It was not there as a trophy. It was a record that when someone tried to treat him like a suspect in his own place, he did not just swallow it and move on. The tiny detail that had saved him was simple. He was the owner, he had cameras, he knew exactly who to contact, and he was prepared to follow through. He knew that not everyone gets those advantages. Not everyone has video, a direct line to a captain, or a lawyer ready to answer an email. But his case went into the system. His incident sat in that officer's file. His complaint helped write a policy that would be sitting in front of the next rookie in the academy. That is how one ridiculous moment became something that actually changed procedure. This was not a viral screaming match. There were no broken doors or big headlines. It was a quiet stop, a bad decision, and a man who refused to let it slide because he understood exactly what had just happened to him. Now think about you. What would you have done in his situation? Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong in a place that was yours or that you had every right to be in? Drop your experience or your thoughts in the comments. Someone else reading might need to know they're not alone. And if you want more real stories about power, profiling, and people who stand their ground with evidence instead of noise, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.
I need both of your IDs right now.
Are we being detained? What crime are you investigating?
A report came in. Just give me your IDs.
A report of what exactly? And what law says we have to identify without reasonable
You're making this
suspicion?
difficult. Don't play games.
We're not playing games. We're asking if this is...
This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part, if one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. A patrol officer named Suarez stood at the edge of a breakfast booth, shoulders squared like he'd already decided what kind of day this was going to be. Two men sat with plates half finished, napkins pushed aside, and a small spread of papers and markers between them. The men stayed seated, calm, still eating, still refusing to give up control of the moment. Suarez kept pressing for identification. He framed it like a simple request, but he repeated it like a command. The men didn't match his energy, they didn't raise their voices, they didn't reach for pockets, they didn't scramble to prove innocence. They did the opposite. They asked again and again what crime they were suspected of and whether they were being detained. Suarez didn't answer those questions in a way that cleared anything up. He kept circling back to the same idea. If nothing was wrong, showing ID would make it easy. The men didn't take the bait. They kept pushing the legal line back into the center of the conversation. No crime, no reasonable suspicion, no detention, no ID. And around them, the restaurant went quiet in that specific way it did when strangers decided they were watching a situation instead of eating breakfast. Now, before this goes any further, tell everyone where you're watching from. Country, state, city, anything. And if you watch stories about power getting checked by facts, boundaries, and accountability, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because what happened next wasn't luck. It was the kind of thing that only happens when someone stays calm, stays precise, and the right eyes show up at the right time. The two men at the booth were Malik Grant and Evan Cole. On the surface, they looked like two guys doing paperwork over breakfast. Hoodies, casual jackets, nothing flashy, no cop look, no visible gear. But they weren't civilians. They were undercover detectives running an operation, and the papers and markers weren't random. They were planning, tracking, timing. The kind of work that lived on notes, maps, schedules, and quick corrections written in bold colors, so nothing got missed. It was mid-morning at a family restaurant that catered to regulars. The atmosphere was predictable. Coffee refills, local gossip, plates sliding across counters, people who felt like they owned the space because they'd been there 100 times. Malik and Evan didn't fit in the way some people measured belonging. They weren't loud, they weren't causing a scene, but they were focused, working and talking about banks in a way that wasn't casual. That was all it took. A waitress named Tessa noticed them early. Not because they were disruptive, because they had papers spread out and they weren't talking softly. She overheard the word banks more than once. She saw a marker in someone's hand. She saw them pointing at something on the table. And instead of asking what they needed or treating it like normal business meeting behavior, she treated it like a threat. She didn't frame it as two customers doing paperwork. She framed it as fear. She reported that other customers were worried, that the men seemed like they were planning something. She used the words that would make someone respond fast. When the call reached patrol, it didn't come in as, "They're loud." It came in as suspicious talk about banks. It came in as the kind of vague warning that carried a lot of implication, but almost no facts. Suarez arrived ready to be the guy who stopped something before it happened. The problem was, he didn't walk in ready to observe. He walked in ready to confirm. He scanned the room and locked onto the booth. He didn't start by asking staff what they actually saw. He didn't separate rumor from detail. He went straight to Malik and Evan like they were already halfway guilty, and he just needed the paperwork to complete the story. He approached with the posture of authority that wasn't technically a detention yet, but was designed to feel like one. He positioned himself so leaving would mean brushing past him. He stood close enough that the booth didn't feel private anymore. Malik looked up first, and he didn't move fast. He didn't act surprised. He acted like a man who'd spent years handling unpredictable moments without giving them extra oxygen. Evan stayed quiet at first, eyes on Suarez, reading him. Not emotional, not aggressive, just assessing. Suarez started with questions that sounded casual on paper. What were they working on? Why so many papers? What did they mean by banks? Who were they? Then the questions narrowed toward identity. Suarez asked for IDs. Malik didn't comply. He didn't refuse in a dramatic way. He refused in a controlled way. He asked what crime was being investigated. He asked what reasonable suspicions Suarez had. He asked whether they were being detained or free to go. That's where the power game started to show. Suarez didn't give a clear detention. He also didn't let it be a normal conversation. He tried to hold them in place without saying the words that would trigger legal standards. He tried to get what he wanted, names, information, control, without committing to an actual basis. Evan stepped in then, still calm, still seated, but more direct. He repeated the same questions Malik asked. What crime? What specific suspicious behavior? Were they detained? Suarez didn't answer cleanly. Instead, he pushed the familiar pressure line. If they weren't doing anything wrong, showing ID would be quick and easy. He treated their refusal like a sign of guilt. He treated compliance like the price of peace. Malik and Evan didn't argue feelings. They argued process. They pointed out that a waitress's vague fear wasn't a crime. They pointed out that talking about banks wasn't illegal. They pointed out that having papers and markers at a breakfast table didn't create reasonable suspicion. And then they did something that made Suarez visibly more irritated. They suggested he go talk to the waitress and get actual facts instead of fishing for IDs from two people who were just sitting there. That suggestion hit Suarez's ego because it exposed what he was doing. It wasn't investigation. It was leverage. The room had shifted by then. A couple people at nearby tables were watching too hard. Someone near the counter had their phone angled in a way that didn't look like texting. The restaurant's ceiling cameras were pointed down across the booths, silent and unblinking. Suarez kept standing there, and the longer he stayed, the more it looked like what it was. One officer trying to turn discomfort into authority. Malik and Evan held the line. No escalation. No sudden moves. No yelling. Just consistent questions and consistent refusal. And that's the part most people don't understand until they see it. Staying calm doesn't end pressure. Sometimes it increases it because it removes the excuse to call you the problem. Suarez tried a new angle. He leaned into the social script, the one that's worked for him before. The script where the officer plays reasonable and the citizen plays difficult. The script where the crowd assumes the officer must have a reason. But Malik and Evan didn't give him the performance. They kept it clinical. They kept it simple. They kept it on the record. And then, right when Suarez seemed ready to either double down or manufacture something more, the front door opened and a new person walked in. This person didn't scan the room like a customer looking for a seat. He looked like someone who noticed everything. Someone who belonged in the building in a way Suarez hadn't considered. He took 2 steps in and looked towards the booth and recognized Malik and Evan instantly. That recognition was the tiny detail that changed everything. The man who walked in was Mason Hale. Plain clothes, no uniform, but he carried himself like someone who'd worn one for a long time. He paused just long enough to take in the posture at the booth. Suarez standing over two seated men, the table covered in notes, the whole room watching. Hale didn't ask the hostess for a table. He didn't pretend this was none of his business. He walked straight toward them. Suarez noticed him late because Suarez was still locked into his own pressure routine. But Malik saw Hale immediately. Evan did too. Neither man looked relieved. They looked ready for the next move, whichever way it went. Hale reached the booth and gave Malik a quick nod that said he knew exactly who he was. Then he looked at Evan the same way. Recognition, familiarity, professional. Suarez's face changed before anyone said anything out loud. He didn't have to be told what it meant. He could see it. Two men he'd been treating like suspects were being acknowledged like colleagues. Hale asked Suarez what the situation was. Suarez tried to summarize it in the safest language possible. He kept it vague, like the original complaint. Customers were concerned, talk about banks, papers on the table. He was just checking. Hale didn't accept the summary as justification. He asked what specific crime was being investigated and what specific behavior created reasonable suspicion. He asked whether Suarez had detained them or whether this was consensual. That's when the whole thing tightened, because Malik and Evan had already asked those questions multiple times, and Suarez had avoided answering them. Now, the same questions were coming from someone Suarez couldn't dismiss. Suarez tried to pivot into the public safety explanation again, but Hale cut through it by forcing it back to standards, what facts, what suspicion, what legal basis. Malik finally ended the uncertainty without making it a show. He identified himself as a detective, still calm, still seated. Evan followed with the same. They did it the way experienced undercover guys did it. Short, controlled, not flashing anything around for the dining room. Hale confirmed it with his own reaction. He addressed them like detectives and asked briefly if they were good. In that moment, Suarez understood he had walked into a restaurant, trying to fish IDs from two people who knew the law better than he did and who could make the consequences real. The tone flipped so fast it was obvious to everyone watching. Suarez stepped back half a pace. His voice dropped. His posture softened. The same man who'd been leaning on, "If you're doing nothing wrong," now sounded like he was trying to rewind the last 5 minutes. Hale didn't let him. He told Suarez, clearly and without yelling, that a vague complaint about talking about banks and having papers wasn't reasonable suspicion. He pointed out that asking for ID without grounds was not a harmless habit. It was a constitutional problem and a community trust problem. He reminded Suarez that a consensual encounter stayed consensual only if people were actually free to refuse, and that hovering over a booth demanding ID looked like a detention, no matter how it was labeled. Hale also pointed out the mistake Suarez had made from the start. He hadn't even gone back to the source to separate what was actually observed from what was assumed. He had treated a nervous story as evidence. Malik didn't pile on. He didn't gloat. He kept his face neutral and his voice level. He told Suarez the same thing he'd been saying all along. If there was no crime and no suspicion, there was no reason to demand identification. He kept it simple. He made it about the rule, not about Suarez as a person. Evan added one more point, still measured. Suarez's favorite line, "If you're doing nothing wrong," wasn't a legal standard. It was a pressure tactic. And it didn't become valid just because a badge said it. Suarez tried to recover by saying he was just following up because people were worried. Hale didn't argue that people could feel worried. He argued what police could do with worry. He drew the line between feelings and facts. And then Hale made it practical. He told Suarez that his body camera would show the entire exchange, including the repeated refusal to articulate suspicion, and that supervisors would not defend ID phishing if it became a complaint. That part mattered, because now it wasn't just Malik and Evan holding a boundary. It was oversight, documentation, a clear record, the thing that turned a street-level power play into a professional liability. Suarez finally backed off. He told Malik and Evan he hadn't known who they were. He apologized, but it wasn't the kind of apology that fixes what just happened. It was the kind of apology people give when they realize they pushed the wrong target. Hale didn't let Suarez leave without one final correction. He told him, quietly but firm, that the job wasn't to turn stereotypes into stops. The job was to observe, verify, and only escalate when facts supported it. Suarez nodded like he understood. Then he turned away from the booth and walked out. The restaurant noise came back in small pieces. Silverware, low voices, coffee being poured. Like everyone had been holding their breath and didn't realize it until it ended. Malik and Evan didn't celebrate. They didn't even look around to see who had been watching. They gathered their papers, stacked the markers, and kept their focus on what they'd come there to do. Because for them, that booth wasn't just a breakfast table. It was a reminder of how fast a normal morning could get dangerous when someone in authority decided a story sounded exciting enough to chase. In the hours after Suarez left, the moment didn't stay in that booth. The restaurant had ceiling cameras. Suarez had a body cam. And at least one customer had recorded a short clip showing the basic shape of it. An officer pressing two calm men for ID without clearly naming a crime, then shifting fast when a plainclothes supervisor arrived. By the end of the day, it was circulating locally. Some people defended Suarez as being cautious. Others pointed out that caution still had legal limits, and vague fear wasn't reasonable suspicion. Inside the department, Hale treated it like a policy problem, not internet drama. He pulled Suarez in and walked through the exact failures. He hadn't verified what the waitress actually observed. He couldn't articulate a specific crime, and he tried to turn a voluntary contact into compliance by leaning on pressure language instead of facts. Hale made one point stick. This wasn't only wrong because the men were detectives. It would have been wrong with any customers. The restaurant got contacted too. Management addressed the staff process for calling police because customers feel weird wasn't a reportable crime. The waitress admitted she hadn't heard a plan or seen anything illegal. She heard the word banks, saw papers and markers, and filled in the rest. She was given corrective guidance and a formal warning about escalating assumptions. Suarez didn't get a dramatic punishment. What he got was real-world accountability, a documented counseling entry, and mandatory refresher training focused on consensual encounters, detention standards, and ID requests. The kind of correction that follows an officer and becomes a bigger issue if it happens again. Malik and Evan didn't chase attention. They kept running their operation, and they made a practical change. They stopped using that restaurant for planning. Undercover work depended on staying ordinary, and the place had already shown it could turn ordinary into suspicious with one bad assumption. Weeks later, their paper and marker planning proved what it always was: actual police work. The patterns they'd mapped led to a clean stop tied to the activity they were tracking around financial locations. No headlines, just a solid case, the kind that protected people quietly. And that's where the full lesson landed. The most important thing wasn't that Suarez accidentally pressured undercover detectives. The important thing was how easily a vague complaint almost became a detention without legal grounds, and how fast the tone changed only when oversight entered the room. That's what accountability looks like in real life. Cameras, standards, supervisors who don't excuse shortcuts, and people who know how to calmly demand the legal basis before they give up their identity. So here's the question for you. If you were in that booth and an officer kept pushing for ID without naming a crime, would you have known what to ask, and would you have stayed calm enough to hold the line? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs the reminder. And subscribe if you want more story times where dignity and facts beat pressure.
Give me your identification.
What's this about? I'm just parked here waiting for my wife.
You look suspicious. That's all I need.
My phone is ringing. I'm gonna answer.
Make it quick.
This is Darnell Carter.
Yes.
Executive Director, Police Accountability Commission.
All right, listen. This is the kind of parking lot encounter that makes people say, that can't be real, until you remember how fast a normal day can turn into a controlled situation when someone with a badge decides they're in charge of the story. The officer had Darnell Carter boxed in so tight with the patrol SUV that Darnell couldn't back out even if he wanted to. The officer stood at the driver's side window, posture stiff, one hand hovering near his belt, and kept pressing for identification while treating the whole thing like Darnell had done something wrong just by sitting there. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we jump in, tell us where you're watching from. What city and state? And if you watch these stories because you care about dignity, accountability, and people not getting pushed around just because someone has power, hit like and subscribe. Now, rewind. It was a normal day at a shopping plaza in Cedar Rapids. Late afternoon, busy parking lanes, people coming and going with bags, carts, kids. Darnell wasn't speeding through town. He wasn't causing a scene. He was parked. He was waiting on his wife, and he was doing what a lot of people do when they're killing time, reading through papers in the car, the kind of quiet moment that's supposed to be nothing. Engine off, seatbelt off, papers in his lap, phone nearby, no music blasting, no one yelling, just waiting. Darnell was black, mid-career, clean-cut, the kind of guy who stayed organized. He was used to being careful in public spaces, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because he understood something a lot of people learn the hard way. The same harmless behavior can get read differently depending on who's doing it. He had been parked long enough to finish a few pages when he noticed the patrol vehicle. It didn't glide past like routine traffic. It slowed, it angled. It turned into the lane like it had picked him out. And then it did something that changed the whole situation. The patrol SUV pulled in behind Darnell's car, close, too close. Not a normal parking behind someone close, more like a deliberate block. Then, to make it worse, the officer angled the SUV in a way that left Darnell's front end boxed by another parked vehicle and his rear pinned by the patrol unit. That's not a casual contact. That's a detention move. Darnell sat still. He didn't start the car. He didn't reach around. He didn't jump out. He waited, hands visible, papers lowered. He watched the officer in the side mirror and the rear view, tracking every step. The officer approached with a certain energy, like the decision had already been made that something was wrong, and now the officer just needed Darnell to fit the story. The officer stood by the window and demanded identification. Darnell didn't argue right away. He asked what this was about, because he was literally sitting in a parked car in a public lot, waiting for his wife. He wanted to know the reason. The officer responded like reasons were optional. He claimed he didn't need one. He said Darnell looked suspicious. He talked in that vague way that can mean anything and nothing at the same time. Then it got worse. The officer used "people like you" language. Not a direct accusation of a specific crime. Not a clear concern like, someone reported a burglary or we're looking for a suspect. It was the kind of phrase that tries to sound like officer safety but lands as profiling. The kind of phrase that tells a person, without saying it outright, that the officer had already sorted them into a category. Darnell stayed measured. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't do the things some people expect. He didn't perform calm in a desperate way. He was just calm. He asked again what the suspicion was based on. The officer didn't answer with facts. He answered with control. He told Darnell to step out of the car. That command changed the stakes immediately, because it wasn't just about ID anymore. Now it was about compliance under pressure. Darnell took a breath. He moved slowly. He made it obvious he wasn't trying to surprise anyone. He told the officer he was reaching for his wallet because his ID was in it. That should have reduced tension. That's what people are told to do. Announce your movements, keep it visible, move slow. But the officer reacted like Darnell had done something aggressive. The officer's posture tightened. The officer's voice got sharper. The officer treated that reach toward the center console like it was a threat, like Darnell had reached for something else. And this is where the power chess starts showing. Because once an officer frames a normal movement as suspicious, the person on the other side is suddenly defending against an accusation that isn't based on anything real. Darnell had to manage his body, his tone, his hands, his wording, while the officer got to escalate on vibes. The officer ordered him to stop moving. Darnell froze exactly where he was, wallet still not even fully in hand. He made his hands visible again. He waited for instructions like his safety depended on it, because it did. The officer then had him step out and immediately put hands on him. Not a casual pat-down. A frisk. The officer ran through the motions like it was justified by suspicious behavior, even though the only behavior was sitting in a parked car and reaching for a wallet after being told to provide ID. Darnell didn't resist. He didn't argue during the frisk. He let it happen, because he knew how quickly a minor disagreement turns into a bigger story when the person with the badge decides it will. After the frisk, the officer took the ID and ran Darnell's information. And that's where this should have ended, because it came back clean. No warrants, no criminal history, nothing that matched the officer's implied narrative. In a normal world, the officer would hand the ID back, maybe give a short explanation and leave. But the officer didn't leave. Instead, the officer stayed right there, keeping Darnell standing outside his own car, continuing to question him like he was still trying to catch him in something. The questions weren't about a specific crime. They were fishing questions, the kind that keep a person trapped in a conversation where every answer can be twisted. Darnell answered without giving extra. He kept it short and clear. He was waiting for his wife, he was reading papers, and he wasn't doing anything illegal. The officer responded with dismissive comments, not overt slurs, not something that would be easy to summarize as one bad phrase, more like a constant drip of disrespect, tone, sarcasm, and the implication that Darnell's explanation wasn't good enough even though it was completely normal. The detention stretched. People walked past, some glanced, some looked away fast. That's how these things often happen. Public enough for witnesses, but private enough that everyone feels like it's not their business. But at least one person noticed the pattern. A man being kept outside his vehicle, searched, cleared, and still treated like a problem. Darnell noticed that too. He saw the passersby. He saw the momentary eye contact. He didn't try to recruit help. He didn't wave anyone over. He stayed focused on one goal: getting out of this without giving the officer an excuse to escalate. Then his phone rang. And it wasn't just a random call. It was the kind of call that mattered enough that ignoring it felt risky. But answering it under this kind of scrutiny also carried risk, because now the officer could use it as another excuse to control the situation. Darnell looked at the officer, signaled what was happening, and made it clear he was about to answer. The officer hesitated, like he wanted to say no. And right there, right before Darnell hit accept, was the moment the entire stop balanced on a thin line. Because the next thing Darnell revealed would change the officer's tone so fast, it would feel like someone flipped a switch. Darnell's phone rang while he was still standing outside his car, still technically detained, still being treated like he owed the officer an explanation for existing in a parking lot. He didn't snap for his phone. He didn't rush. He kept his hands where the officer could see them and made a small, controlled motion to indicate what was happening. He made it clear he was about to answer a call. The officer didn't like it. His body language shifted like he was deciding whether to block it. He couldn't quite justify it out loud, though, because the situation was already thin. No crime, no warrants, no reason that held up. Darnell answered anyway, and he kept it brief. He identified himself the way people do when the call matters and time matters. Then he said the title that changed the temperature in the air. He explained he was the executive director of the city's Police Accountability Commission. The change in the officer was immediate. A second earlier, the officer had been dismissive, controlling, casual about authority. Now he became careful. His posture loosened just enough to signal he was backtracking without saying it. His voice dropped into a more professional register. He stopped using vague, suspicious framing and shifted toward procedural language. Darnell ended the call and looked at the officer again. He didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He didn't do the "do you know who I am" routine. He did something more effective. He went quiet and let the contrast speak for itself. Because the contrast was the proof. The officer had been comfortable treating him like a problem until it became clear Darnell had a role connected to oversight. Now the officer wanted to control the damage. The officer returned Darnell's ID. The officer started moving toward a soft exit, the kind officers use when they want an encounter to disappear. He acted like it had been a routine check. He acted like the delay had been normal. He tried to wrap it up as if the earlier language in the frisk and the fishing questions hadn't happened. But Darnell didn't let the officer rewrite what had just occurred. He stayed calm and precise. He asked again what the actual reason was for the stop and the frisk. He asked why he'd been boxed in. He asked why he'd been kept there after his record came back clean. The officer didn't give a real answer. He tried to keep it vague. He tried to suggest it was about suspicious behavior without naming any behavior that would hold up. Darnell kept his tone steady and didn't escalate. He just made it clear he was tracking every step. And while this exchange was happening, someone nearby was tracking it too. A witness, someone who had been walking toward the storefronts, had slowed down earlier when they saw the patrol SUV blocking the car. They noticed Darnell wasn't yelling. They noticed he wasn't acting reckless. They noticed he was being treated like a suspect anyway. The witness didn't intervene directly. They didn't try to argue with the officer. They did what people have learned to do in situations like this. They observed, they remembered details, and they prepared to report it. The officer, now aware the moment could have consequences, started rapping faster. He gave Darnell a final dismissive comment, lighter than before, but still meant to place the officer above accountability. The message was basically that Darnell should be grateful he was being checked, like the inconvenience and humiliation were normal costs of doing business. Darnell didn't argue. He didn't lecture. He just said one line that ended the encounter cleanly. He stated that being cleared didn't justify being treated like a suspect in the first place, and that he would be following up formally. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just made it clear this wasn't going to disappear. The officer walked back to his SUV and drove off. And just like that, the parking lot went back to normal on the surface. But Darnell didn't feel normal. His hands were steady, but his mind was already moving through the timeline like a checklist. The boxing in, the ID demand without reason, the people like you language, the escalation when he reached for his wallet, the frisk, the clean return, the extended detention anyway. Then the sudden tone shift after the title. Those details mattered because they revealed motive and pattern, not just one moment. A few minutes later, Darnell's wife, Maya, came out of a store with a small bag and the look of someone expecting a normal pickup. She saw his expression first. Then she saw the way he was standing, still in that controlled, post-incident posture people get when something has just happened and they're trying to keep it contained. Darnell told her, quickly, what happened. Not with drama, with facts. Maya looked around the lot like she was trying to picture it. She asked where the officer went. She asked if Darnell was okay. She asked if anyone saw it. That's when Darnell pointed out the witness nearby, someone who had lingered longer than a casual shopper would. The witness approached just enough to make it clear they weren't imagining things. They told Darnell they saw the stop and felt it was wrong. They said they were willing to file a complaint and provide a statement about what they observed. The boxing in, the frisk, the length of detention, the way the officer spoke. That witness statement became the second key piece. Because in these situations, it's not just about what happened. It's about what can be verified. Darnell didn't waste time. That same day, he documented everything while it was fresh. Times, location, patrol car position, the sequence of commands, the fact he was cleared and still detained, the tone shift after he identified his role. Then he did something most people don't have the access or energy to do. He started the accountability process immediately. A complaint was filed. The witness filed one too. And that mattered because it forced the incident into a formal track. It wasn't a private grievance anymore. It was an official record with multiple points of contact, connected to a stop that should have ended the moment the officers saw there was nothing there. That complaint triggered a Bodycam review. And the Bodycam didn't just capture an officer doing a stop. It captured the pattern, vague suspicion, aggressive control, and the way the officer treated Darnell before and after learning who he was. Once the review started, the city couldn't pretend it was nothing. Darnell didn't posture publicly. He didn't run to social media first. He followed the system the way it was supposed to work. Because if the system was legitimate, it should hold even when the person complaining was just a regular resident. But this time, the person complaining wasn't just a resident. He was also someone whose job existed, because the city claimed it believed in accountability. And that made the next phase unavoidable. Within days, conversations started happening behind closed doors. Not because the city suddenly cared about Darnell's comfort, but because the city could see what the footage showed, and they could see how the officer's language and choices would look under a review. Darnell then did the next step. He filed a civil rights lawsuit, not as a threat, as a documented response. He alleged the stop and detention were unconstitutional, rooted in profiling, and extended without lawful justification. The clean record made the extended detention harder to defend. The witness statement made it harder to dismiss. The body cam made it harder to spin. And then the story started to spread. Not because Darnell wanted it to be viral, because people in the community recognized the pattern immediately. They had their own versions of it. Different parking lots, different officers, different excuses. Same vague suspicious label. Same I don't need a reason attitude, same imbalance. And once the city realized this case wasn't staying quiet, they had a choice. Fight it and risk everything being exposed in court, or settle and try to control the fallout. They chose to settle, but settling didn't end it, because the officer's conduct wasn't just a misunderstanding. The review didn't stop at the lawsuit. It moved into employment decisions, policy questions, and oversight demands. And that's where the biggest shift happened, because once the footage became public, the officer's behavior wasn't judged by internal culture anymore. It was judged by everyone. Once the complaint and the witness statement hit the system, the tone around the incident changed fast, because it was no longer just one person's word against an officer's. There was a time-stamped complaint. There was an independent witness, and there was Bodycam. The city initiated a formal review, and internally, that meant 2 tracks running at the same time, a legal track and a discipline track. On the legal side, the city's attorneys wanted to know one thing. Could they defend the officer's reason for boxing Darnell in and detaining him after the record check came back clean? On the discipline side, supervisors had to answer another question. Did the officer violate policy through the way he initiated the contact, escalated it, and prolonged it? Because from the outside, it looked simple. A man was parked, waiting for his wife, reading papers. The officer turned that into a stop without a clear reason, then kept it going even when there was nothing to support it. And that's the part people miss. The harm isn't only the frisk. It's the message that the person can be treated like a suspect without cause, and then held there until the officer decides to stop. The body cam footage became the center of everything. It showed the officer's initial approach and the setup. The patrol SUV placed behind Darnell's car in a way that trapped him. It showed the officer's repeated insistence on ID without explaining a specific complaint or alleged crime. It captured the suspicious framing without facts. And it captured the people like you phrasing that had no place in a professional stop. Most importantly, it captured the sequence that made it indefensible. Darnell did what the public is told to do. He moved slowly, announced he was reaching for his wallet, and kept his hands visible. The officer treated that as an escalation anyway. Then came the frisk. Then came the records check. Then came the clean return. And then, still no release. Instead of ending the encounter, the officer kept fishing. He kept Darnell outside the car, still under control, still being questioned, still being treated like an explanation wasn't enough. Then the call happened, and the footage caught the pivot. The moment Darnell identified his role as executive director of the Police Accountability Commission, the officer's demeanor changed. The officer didn't suddenly discover a new legal standard. He didn't suddenly remember policy. He just adjusted because the risk changed. That contrast wasn't subtle on video, and supervisors knew it. Attorneys knew it. Anyone who watched knew it. Darnell's lawsuit moved quickly because it was built on clear elements. The stop lacked a solid, articulable reason. The detention was prolonged after exculpatory information came back, and the officer's language suggested bias. The city tried the usual early moves, minimize, delay, and reframe it as routine. But there was a problem. Routine doesn't mean lawful. Routine doesn't mean acceptable. And routine definitely doesn't look like boxing a car in, frisking a compliant person, then dragging out questioning after a clean check. Behind the scenes, settlement discussions started earlier than most people would expect. Not because the city wanted to admit fault, because the city could see what discovery would do. Discovery would pull training records, prior complaints, internal messages, stop data and patterns. And once that door opens, it rarely stays contained to a single incident. So the city negotiated. The settlement wasn't framed as an apology on paper. Cities rarely do that. It was framed as resolution, risk management, closing the file. But there was still the employment decision. That part took longer because police discipline often moves slower and has more built-in resistance. Union processes, internal panels, appeals, and benefit of the doubt culture. Still, this case wasn't easy to protect. The footage wasn't a gray area. It showed the initial power move, the lack of clear justification, the escalation over a wallet reach, and the prolonged detention despite a clean check. It showed a tone shift linked to status, not safety. The department terminated the officer. The city didn't do it loudly at first. They did it through process. Termination notice, separation paperwork, a statement that stayed vague in public. But the story didn't stay quiet because the footage didn't stay private. Once public records requests and legal timelines moved forward, the video became accessible. And once it hit the internet, the public didn't watch it like an internal review board. They watched it like people who've seen this pattern before. The clip started spreading because it had the exact ingredients that make people stop scrolling. A calm black man in a parked car, an officer using authority without explanation, a stop that kept going for no reason, and then the immediate tone flip when the officer realized who he was dealing with. The virality wasn't about celebrity. It was about recognition. People shared it with captions that all sounded like the same point. This is what happens when the person doesn't have a title to protect them. Local reporters picked it up. Community meetings referenced it. People started calling in with similar stories. Some were recent, some were years old. But the pattern was consistent enough that it created pressure beyond Darnell's personal case. And pressure creates action, especially when it's tied to documentation. The policy conversation shifted from, "This was a misunderstanding," to "What safeguards failed here?" That's when the city was pushed into changes it had been slow walking for a long time. Mandatory body cams became less of a best practice and more of a hard requirement with enforcement. Not just wear it, but turn it on. with consequences for not recording. And the Police Accountability Commission's access changed too, because the core issue wasn't just having footage. It was who could see it, how fast, and whether it could be delayed until public attention died down. The city revised oversight access rules, so independent review couldn't be stalled behind internal gatekeeping. And none of that happened because the city woke up with new morals. It happened because one stop was documented clearly enough that it couldn't be explained away. In the middle of all that, Darnell stayed consistent. He didn't become a loud public figure. He didn't treat the settlement like a victory lap. He treated it like proof. The city resolved the case because they knew what the video showed. And in private, when the noise died down, there was still the personal aftermath. Because being right doesn't erase what it feels like to be treated like a threat in a parking lot, while people walk past pretending they don't see it. Darnell went back to his work with the commission knowing something he already suspected, but now he had the clearest example possible. The difference between how you're treated and how you're supposed to be treated can come down to one thing: whether the system thinks you can fight back. And that's exactly why the ending mattered. Because this didn't just end with a settlement and a termination, it ended with a policy shift that made it harder for the next ridiculous stop to stay invisible. If you've ever been in a situation where someone tried to use power to make you feel small, drop in the comments what you would have done in Darnell's place. And if you want more real, grounded stories about accountability and people standing firm without losing control, make sure you subscribe.
She grabbed my arm. I need you to do something right now before she deletes it and posts me online.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened, start to finish.
She rolled up with music, got disrespectful, called me racist, and then she grabbed me. I want this handled.
Stay right here with me. Don't walk toward her.
I'm telling you.
Separately.
Tell me what happened from your side and keep it simple.
He ordered me to turn my music off like he owned the place. Shouted racist phrases at me.
Did you touch him at any point? Grab his arm?
No, I didn't touch him. Not once.
She's lying. She grabbed my arm.
Do you have video of the interaction?
Yes, right here. I've been recording.
Turn around, hands behind your back.
Janelle Carter kept her phone up at chest level, steady like she'd done it 100 times, while Chase Whitaker stood a few feet closer than he needed to, talking fast, louder than the music ever was. He was telling the responding officers that she had grabbed his arm and attacked him, and he wanted them to do something right now, before she deleted everything and posted him online. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we rewind, tell me where you're watching from, country or state, in the comments. And if you're into stories where cameras, receipts, and calm boundaries beat loud accusations, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It happened at a Love's gas station on August 29th, 2025. One of those bright, always busy travel stops where people come and go like background noise. Plenty of cameras, plenty of witnesses, and plenty of room for a small confrontation to turn into a police report. Janelle was known there, not famous, just familiar. Staff recognized her face, her car, the way she came in, grabbed what she needed, and left without drama. She wasn't the type employees had to watch, and that mattered later more than anyone realized at the start. Chase wasn't a regular to the staff in the same way. That didn't mean anything by itself, but it meant nobody at the store had a pre-built story about him. So when he started giving officers a confident version of events, the only thing backing it up was his voice. The call that brought police out was a battery complaint. Chase had reported that a woman had battered him. He described her outfit purple and her car, black Mercedes. He said she pulled up with loud music, cursed at him, called him racist, threatened to put him on social media, then grabbed his arm. He told dispatch he wanted officers to hurry. That hurry part wasn't accidental. Chase was trying to control the pace before anyone could slow the story down and test it. When officers arrived, he leaned into urgency. His body language said he wanted them to treat the situation like it was already decided. He kept circling back to the same points: loud music, disrespect, being called racist, and the arm grab. He framed it like he was minding his business and got attacked for it. Janelle's posture, stayed different. She didn't perform panic. She didn't do the dramatic hands up innocence act either. She gave what sounded like a timeline, not a speech. According to her, the music wasn't blasting. She said Chase had aggressively ordered her to turn it off, and it wasn't a request, it was a command. She said he followed her, staying in her space, and she started recording because she didn't trust what he might claim later. She denied touching him at all. And she said the first time he described it as her hitting or grabbing him was after officers were already on scene. That last detail is the kind of detail that can change everything. Because in a lot of parking lot calls, the first story officers hear becomes the default story. Whoever seems calmer gets believed. Whoever sounds most certain gets believed. Whoever uses the right keywords gets believed. But Officer Luis Ramirez and Officer Shannon Price didn't lock onto Chase's certainty. They did something simple that a lot of people don't expect in the middle of a messy accusation. They looked for proof. Janelle already had her phone video. She didn't act like it was a weapon. She treated it like a seatbelt, something you hope you never need, but you're glad you put it on. While one officer kept both parties separated, the other watched the clip, and the video didn't match the claim. On the recording, Chase was seen making the accusation that Janelle had grabbed him, while Janelle was clearly not within arm's reach. Officers estimated she was about 10 feet away when he said it. Not 2 feet. Not close enough for a quick grab. 10 feet. That doesn't just poke a hole in a story. It changes what the story is. Now, the incident wasn't simply a dispute about music. It wasn't even just a disagreement about who was rude first. It became a question of whether Chase had called 911 and accused someone of battery without it happening. And while the officers were processing that, the store employees started adding context. Devin Pike, one of the employees working that shift, told officers Janelle was a regular and didn't cause problems. Another staff member backed it up. Then the shift manager, Tina Alvarez, got involved and told officers she could call a manager to access surveillance footage because there were cameras pointed at the pumps and a good chance the area was covered. That offer mattered. It signaled that the store wasn't afraid of what the cameras would show. It signaled confidence. Chase, meanwhile, didn't have any footage. He didn't have a witness stepping up for him. He had his claim. And then he admitted something that officers often listen for. He had no video proof of her grabbing his arm. In a world where everybody's phone is always out, that's not automatically a lie. Plenty of real incidents don't get recorded, but here, the person he was accusing did have a recording, and it contradicted him in a clean, measurable way. Distance. This is where the power chess part shows up. Chase had tried to use the system as leverage. He used key phrases that make police move fast. Battery, aggressor, hurry, threat to post online. He pushed the idea that he was being targeted and harassed. But Janelle's move wasn't louder. It was cleaner. Record first. Speak second. Keep space. Let the facts carry the weight. The officers didn't rush to make her prove she didn't do it. They did what they were supposed to do. Compare statements to evidence. And once the evidence didn't match Chase's allegation, the direction of the call flipped. Instead of treating Janelle like a suspect, officers started treating Chase's report like the potential offense. He wasn't just mistaken. The accusation was specific. He said she grabbed his arm. He called 911 for it. He wanted immediate action. Yet the only video in play showed him making the claim while she was too far away to have done what he said. That's not a gray area, that's math. At that point, officers detained Chase. His tone shifted, less certainty, more frustration. The officers stayed procedural. They weren't debating him, they were documenting. He was arrested for making a false report. On top of that, he was cited for disorderly conduct and obstruction, based on how he acted during the investigation and response. Janelle wasn't celebrated. She wasn't treated like a hero. She was treated like what she was, the person who didn't lie, didn't escalate, and had receipts. Before officers cleared the scene, they gave her contact information and asked her to send any additional videos she had for the case. That detail is important too. It showed they were building the report around evidence, not around whoever shouted first. And just like that, a moment that could have gone sideways at a gas station ended with the person who made the accusation being the one put in cuffs. As soon as Chase Whitaker realized the call wasn't going the way he expected, his whole strategy changed. A minute earlier, he'd been pushing urgency, trying to make the officers treat his story like it was already proven. But the second officer, Luis Ramirez, pointed out the distance issue on Janelle Carter's video. Chase stopped acting like the victim of a battery and started acting like someone trying to talk his way out of consequences. He began reframing. He leaned into the idea that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. He tried to make it about feelings instead of facts. He tried to make it about respect again. But police reports don't run on vibes. They run on timelines. Officer Shannon Price did what good officers do in messy public disputes. She separated the noise from the measurable. She kept asking the same kinds of questions: where everyone stood when the supposed contact happened, how it happened, what came before it, and what proof existed of any of it. Chase's answer kept landing in the same place. He didn't have proof of the arm grab, and the only video being shown didn't support his claim. And Janelle didn't try to win the conversation. She stayed in her lane. She kept her voice level. She kept space between herself and Chase. She let the record speak. That's the part a lot of people don't understand until they're in it. Calm isn't weakness. Calm is control. While Chase was detained, the store side of the story got even clearer. Devin Pike and shift manager Tina Alvarez weren't trying to take sides emotionally. They were doing something more useful than that. They were offering context and access. They explained to the officers that Janelle was a regular who didn't cause problems. Not perfect, not an angel, just consistent. The kind of customer who didn't bring drama into their store. That alone didn't prove innocence. But it mattered because it lowered the odds that she randomly snapped into violence at a pump. Then Tina made the next move that pushed the whole situation from a parking lot argument into a documented case. She initiated the process to get surveillance. Love's Locations didn't just hand footage out to anybody, and Tina knew it. She called for a manager and started the standard chain to access camera angles. The officers didn't treat it like overkill. They treated it like confirmation. Because if the cameras showed no physical contact, then this was bigger than a rude exchange. It was a false report with a named person and a serious allegation. And here's something people don't talk about enough. A false report doesn't just waste time. It puts a target on someone who didn't do anything. It invites escalation. It can become an arrest that never should have happened. That's why the tiny detail mattered so much. The distance on the phone video. If Janelle hadn't been recording, the officers would have been standing there with two competing stories and one person insisting he was attacked. In plenty of places, that's enough to make the wrong decision in the moment. Instead, the officers had a clip that froze reality. When Chase was taken into custody, it didn't look dramatic. It looked procedural. He was searched, handcuffed, and walked to the patrol vehicle. The energy at the pump dropped immediately once he was no longer controlling the scene with his voice. Janelle didn't celebrate. She didn't perform relief for anyone. She looked like someone who'd just dodged something she didn't want to think about. Officer Ramirez gave her contact information and instructions for sending over any additional recordings. He also explained what would likely happen next in the simplest terms, because the next part is where people get lost. Reports, evidence uploads, statements, follow-up calls, court dates if needed. Tina and Devin stayed nearby, not hovering, just present. It mattered that Janelle wasn't standing alone while paperwork got finished. It mattered that witnesses were willing to attach their names to what they'd observed, that she wasn't the problem customer, and that they were confident enough to push for camera footage. And meanwhile, Chase's original 911 call wasn't just floating in the air anymore. It became part of the case file. His words, how urgent he sounded, how sure he acted, how he described the alleged battery, were now evidence too. Back at the station, the pieces started lining up in a way Chase probably didn't anticipate. Officers had a false allegation of battery tied to a specific person, a phone video that contradicted the key claim, on-scene admission that he had no video proof, store employees willing to support the idea that the accused person wasn't creating problems, pending surveillance access that could further confirm or deny physical contact. That's not a messy he said, she said. That's a case with an obvious direction. And this is where viewers should ask themselves something. How many people have had the opposite outcome just because they didn't think to record? Over the next couple of days, the incident didn't disappear. Gas station staff talked. Regulars talked. People who weren't even there started hearing the story in pieces, first as gossip, then as a warning. But Janelle didn't run to social media immediately, even though Chase had tried to paint her like someone who would. She focused on the boring part, sending the videos to the officers, saving backups, and writing down everything she remembered while it was still fresh. Time, location, who said what, where everyone stood. That's what accountability actually looks like. Not a viral clip, a clean record. Chase, on the other hand, had a different kind of record being built around him now. His charge for making a false report wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It meant he'd have to answer for why he escalated a confrontation into a criminal accusation without proof. And once a prosecutor saw that phone video detail, the claim happening while the accused stood about 10 feet away, there was no way to pretend it was just confusion. The system doesn't always protect the right person, but when evidence is this clear, it becomes harder for anyone to ignore. And that's where the real consequences started. When Chase Whitaker's case hit court, he didn't look like the guy who demanded officers hurry. He looked like someone who'd finally realized that a 911 call didn't disappear just because the moment was over. The prosecutor didn't need a dramatic angle. The file already had a clean timeline. Chase had called police from the Loves on August 29, 2025, and reported a battery. He had identified Janelle Carter by outfit and car. He had described an arm grab as the reason for the call. Then, when officers arrived, Janelle had a phone recording that showed Chase repeating the allegation while she was clearly several steps away. Store employees had backed up that she was a regular who didn't cause trouble, and surveillance access had been initiated to confirm what the officers were already seeing. The physical contact claim didn't match reality. Chase tried to turn it into a story about disrespect and being embarrassed. He leaned on the argument that he felt threatened and reacted in the moment. But the court kept dragging it back to one point. He didn't report a feeling. He reported a specific act of violence. And when the judge looked at how the allegation was made, how it changed, and what the evidence showed, the case became about accountability for using the system as a weapon. The result wasn't a movie ending. It was the kind of ending that follows people quietly. Chase dealt with the consequences of being charged for a false report. The disorderly conduct and obstruction issues followed him too, tied to how he behaved during the response once officers started checking his story instead of accepting it. Court costs, penalties, and a case record were the kind of consequences that didn't go viral, but absolutely changed what future paperwork and background checks would look like. While Chase tried to manage fallout, Janelle did something that mattered more than arguing with anyone afterward. She treated the whole thing like a lesson in preserving proof. She submitted every video clip she had in full, with original timestamps intact. She saved backups in more than one place. She requested the incident report through the proper process and kept the confirmation trail. She wrote down the names connected to the case: Officer Luis Ramirez, Officer Shannon Price, Sergeant Dane Holt, plus the Love's staff who stepped up: Tina Alvarez and Devin Pike. Not to build a social media moment, to build a record. She also contacted Love's corporate customer relations, not to blame the store, but to make sure the location's cooperation and surveillance process were documented from the business side too. That move mattered because companies pay attention when an incident shows they could be pulled into liability or public scrutiny later. Love's didn't dismiss her. The store staff had done the right thing. They stayed neutral, offered surveillance access, and helped stabilize the situation by backing facts instead of drama. Inside that Love's after August 29th, the atmosphere shifted in small ways. Employees got quicker about pulling a manager in when someone started trying to control another customer. They stopped brushing off early warning signs like aggressive commands, following too close, and escalating a petty argument into a police-level accusation. Tina made sure staff understood the difference between a loud customer and a customer trying to use authority as a threat. Janelle didn't walk away thinking the world had suddenly become fair. She walked away knowing one ugly truth and one useful truth. The ugly truth was that she could do everything right and still be accused. The useful truth was that documentation could keep an accusation from turning into handcuffs. That night could have ended differently if one tiny detail hadn't been there. Video showing distance, clearly enough that nobody could pretend it was a mystery. So here's what this story really teaches. When someone tries to turn a personal confrontation into a police problem, staying calm is only half the battle. The other half is preserving the truth in a way the system can't ignore. Now let me ask you, if you were in Janelle's position, would you have started recording right away? Or would you have assumed the truth would speak for itself? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want more story times where receipts beat loud accusations and accountability actually shows up, hit like, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more.